Good afternoon. This is Media Center Ukraine, Odesa, and we continue with the discussion of the human rights violations in the temporarily occupied territories. Our speakers are Vira Yastrebova, lawyer, director of the NGO Eastern Human Rights Group, and Iryna Chaura, human rights activist. Good afternoon. Quite often here in the Media Center Ukraine, Odesa, we discussed how occupiers put pressure on those Ukrainians who refuse to get Russian passports. And as far as I know, they started doing this with the patients of psychoneurological institutions. Yes, the occupation authorities refuse to treat patients of psychoneurological institutions if they don't have Russian passports. So patients without Russian passport do not give medication, there's no examinations, and people were even threatened with early discharge. For almost 6 months, there has been put pressure on patients of psychoneurological hospitals. And as a result, the patients agreed to get Russian passports. And on the 1st of November 2023, occupation units of the Migration Service of the Russian Federation organized the issuance of Russian passports in these healthcare institutions. We know that occupiers check Ukrainian phones, and there is information that now they have initiated checks of school students' phones. Yes, there have already been recorded cases of checking the phones of school children in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. At first, this was done by teachers. And recently, there have been some changes, and now representatives of the occupation power institutions are involved in checking of school children phones. So the children's phones are taken away, and then the software is installed on them to monitor what websites and apps the children use. So some of the websites are blocked, and there is also control over children messengers. During the phone check, children's installed programs are fixed, like games, Ukrainian information resources, Telegram channels, and in this way the occupiers try to identify pro-Ukrainian children in the temporarily occupied territories because they believe that such children are a threat to the occupation regime. And what do you have any information about repression on the local population in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine? Yes, in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, the repressions continue against the local population in order to identify pro-Ukrainian citizens because they are afraid of Ukrainian resistance. The FSB conducts searches in the homes of local residents. They stop and search cars, check mobile phones of locals. For example, and over the last several weeks, there have been several detention cases. In the Zaporizhzhia region, Russia's FSB detained local residents. There is no exact number known to us. In the process of detaining one of the citizens of Ukraine, was shot by occupiers. Those Ukrainian citizens who have been detained are accused of disagreeing with the occupation authorities. In the temporarily occupied part of the Kherson region, a 32-year-old local resident was detained for the pro-Ukrainian position and disagreement with the Kremlin regime. In the temporarily occupied Luhansk region, a local resident was detained. His mobile phone was checked, and the occupiers found there the Ukrainian mass media and websites, and now he's accused of espionage. We know that there are permanent losses in the army of the occupiers. And we know that they even summon the prisoners from the Ukrainian prisons. Yes, earlier the occupiers informed that they will cancel the sentences. And occupation authorities have already prepared the relevant lists of prisoners whom they plan to recruit for service in the occupation army. Special attention is paid to those who were convicted under Ukrainian legislation before the occupation, mainly for crimes against the foundations of Ukraine's national security. And they manipulate with the feelings of resentment of prisoners to the law enforcement agencies of Ukraine to recruit them to the occupation army. However, if they refuse to join the occupation army, prisoners are threatened with even worse treatment by prison administrations and physical torture. We know that the army of the Russian Federation is the army of looters. There have been a lot of cases, and now, as far as I know, they just take out the grain stolen from Ukraine through the captured Berdyansk port. Yes, this is really the case. Occupiers are taking out grain stolen in the temporarily occupied south of Ukraine through the captured Berdyansk port. Recently, the occupiers have significantly increased the amount of exported grain, and they plan to reach the mark of 150,000 tons of grain every month. For example, in October, the captured seaport of Berdyansk received 9 ships, which is 3 more than a month before. The total amount of processed cargo at the Berdyansk port is 26,700 tons of grain, which is 6,000 tons more than the September figure. Moreover, the Russian Federation continues to rob the port itself. The occupation authorities have issued an order to transfer from the temporarily occupied port of Berdyansk 29 real estate objects, 8 units of the fleet, as well as navigation equipment, to the ownership of the Russian Federation. Do you know anything about the situation at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that is captured by Russians? The question is about workers. As far as I know, they are forced to sign contracts with Rosatom. The Russian Federation has been putting pressure on the workers at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And despite that, there are 812 workers who have not signed contracts with Rosatom. But 2,600 workers have already signed such contracts. However, the occupation authorities have now increased the pressure on the Ukrainian workers of the occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. They have been threatening the station workers that if they do not receive Russian passports and sign contracts with Rosatom by the 1st January 2024, they will not be allowed to enter the station. And they will be even forcibly deported from the temporarily occupied territories because they will not have Russian passports. What is the situation with healthcare services? I know that the situation is terrible there, and there is even lack of ambulances there. The situation is really very difficult. There is a lack of ambulances now. There are 1-2 ambulances operating in one city, and the situation is even worsened by the fact that there is a lack of drivers because men have been mobilized or killed, and no one can drive ambulances at the moment. We know that a lot of Ukrainians have left the temporarily occupied territory territories, and but their houses are still there, their property is still there. What happens with that? And I know that the just occupiers use those houses and rob them. What do you know about this? In the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, the occupation authorities issued actually a command to identify abandoned apartments or houses, to expose them and to open them, to change the locks, and to use them for their own purposes, for example, to settle other people there. This means that in the temporarily occupied territories, just other people will occupy those houses or apartments after looting. What is the situation with orphans and children? Unfortunately, we can see the increasing number of orphans who are returned to orphanages. According to our sources in the Russian Federation, over 8 months of 2023, the citizens of the Russian Federation have returned 20,000 orphans to orphanages. Such a high number of orphans is due to the fact that the Russian Federation began deporting children to the Russian Federation in 2022. If children have illnesses or if adults have failed to find understanding with some children, they are returned to orphanages. I know that children with oncology are not deported by the occupiers, so they create some special camps for them. The occupation authorities of the Russian Federation conduct medical filtration before deporting Ukrainian children. And the situation is so bad that the number of children who have not been deported because of having some health problems. And my colleague has mentioned today that in Russia they refuse from children. And the occupation authorities have decided to open special camps in the temporarily occupied territories for children with oncology. And I should draw your attention to the fact that these are not healthcare institutions. This is just a place for children to die there. So they will just be accommodated and will not be treated. There has been information that occupiers use children to make camouflage nets for the Russian army. In the temporarily occupied Luhansk region, there have been recorded facts of involvement of children to weave camouflage netting for the Russian army. But we should also say that for this procedure, children are forced to wear camouflage uniform. So this is how they make this camouflage netting for the occupiers. And they are still, we all the time receive information that children are forced to get Russian passports. What is the situation now in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine? And the occupiers have been certifying minor children from 1 to 7 years old, and they check their Russian citizenship so that in the future they will receive a Russian passport. And I have a question about women. I know that women have been also recruited to occupation units. How is this process organized, and what is done with those who refuse to join the Russian army? Yes, we can see an increased number of cases of recruiting women to the occupation units. And recently, and according to the information from the local citizens and by analyzing open sources, we can say that there's 30% increase of women in the occupation units. And I have a question about monitoring. I know there are continued rounds on the residents of local residents with the Ukrainian passports. How is this process ongoing? Unfortunately, such filtrations measures continue. And so this is aimed at finding locals with Ukrainian passports. Over the last 2 weeks, there have been 279 searches of local residents who had Ukrainian passports. People were detained and offered freedom in exchange for their consent to get Russian passports. Unfortunately, such roundups are rather regular. Are a lot of people having two passports, Russian and Ukrainian, and those people who agree to get Russian passports to feel freer, they just preserve their Ukrainian passports, waiting for the occupation and for better times. And we believe that the better times will be quite soon for our territories which are occupied now. Thank you very much for joining us today for regarding Russian crimes in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And this is the last briefing for today.